A two-seat roadster with scissor doors, a sprint to 60 in under 3.5 seconds, and a badge that used to mean cheap sports cars from a struggling British brand. That is the strange combination sitting at the center of one of the most surprising automotive stories of the decade. MG, a name most car enthusiasts associated with rust, bankruptcy, and budget hatchbacks, just built an electric sports car that is making people cross-shop it against a Porsche 911. Not a Porsche Taycan. Not some future EV concept. The actual, gasoline-powered, universally worshipped Porsche 911. That sentence alone should sound absurd. MG was, for decades, a brand kept alive on nostalgia and spare parts. It went through so many owners and bankruptcies that longtime fans stopped keeping track. And yet here we are, watching automotive journalists film side-by-side comparisons between a car wearing the MG Octagon badge and one of the most iconic performance cars ever made. Something happened between MG's darkest years and this moment. And that something has a name: China. This is the story of how a dead British brand got resurrected by a Chinese state-owned company, how that company used MG as a Trojan horse to enter markets that were suspicious of anything with "Made in China" stamped on it, and how the result of that decade-long strategy is now a car called the Cyberster, a machine good enough to make Porsche's engineers nervous. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to a time when MG was basically dead. The death and resurrection of a British icon. MG stands for Morris Garages, a company that started in England back in the 1920s, building small, nimble sports cars that punched way above their price point. For most of the 20th century, MG had a specific identity: affordable, fun to drive, a little unreliable, if we're being honest, but the kind of car that made you feel something behind the wheel. British enthusiasts loved MG the way Americans loved the Ford Mustang, an accessible taste of performance that didn't require a trust fund. Kids grew up seeing MG badges parked outside pubs and cottages across the English countryside, and there was a certain romance to owning one, even if it broke down on the side of the road more often than anyone wanted to admit. But by the early 2000s, MG was in serious trouble. The parent company, MG Rover, had been struggling for years, bleeding money, losing market share to more reliable Japanese and German competitors. Rover had tried joint ventures, government bailouts, and desperate partnership talks with companies like Honda and BMW, but nothing stuck long enough to fix the underlying problem. In 2005, MG Rover collapsed entirely. 6,000 jobs disappeared overnight. The factory in Longbridge, England, once a symbol of British industrial pride, went quiet. Workers who had spent their entire careers on that assembly line walked out for the last time with no severance and no clear plan for what came next. For a lot of people, that was the end of the story. MG joined the long list of once great car brands, swallowed up by history, filed away next to names like Saab and Pontiac as cautionary tales about what happens when an industry moves faster than a company can adapt. Except it wasn't the end. A Chinese company called Nanjing Automobile bought the remains of MG Rover in 2005, picking through the wreckage for whatever assets still had value. They wanted the intellectual property, the tooling, the engineering designs, and yes, the brand name itself, which still carried weight even in its weakened state. Then, in 2007, Nanjing itself was absorbed into a much bigger Chinese state-owned company called SAIC Motor, one of the largest automakers in the world that most people outside China have never heard of. SAIC now owned MG. A 100-year-old British sports car brand was now the property of a Chinese state enterprise, run out of Shanghai by executives who had never set foot in Longbridge. For years, nothing dramatic happened. SAIC kept the MG badge alive mostly in China itself, building unremarkable sedans and SUVs that wore the Octagon logo but had none of the sporting spirit the brand used to represent. If you'd asked a car enthusiast in 2015 what MG was doing, most wouldn't have known it still existed at all. Some assumed it had quietly died along with Rover a decade earlier. The badge would occasionally show up in an obscure export market, but it had none of the cultural relevance it once carried in Britain. But SAIC wasn't just keeping the lights on out of sentiment. They were playing a much longer game. And around 2019, that game started to reveal itself. The strategy nobody saw coming. Here's the problem SAIC faced. They wanted to sell cars in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, in markets where consumers had decades of skepticism baked in about Chinese manufacturing. Selling a car under a brand called SAIC, or some other unfamiliar Chinese name, was going to be an uphill battle. Consumers in London or Sydney weren't going to trust an unknown Chinese nameplate with their money, no matter how good the engineering was. This wasn't necessarily fair, but it was reality. Decades of cheap knockoff electronics and skepticism about manufacturing quality had left a mark on how Western consumers viewed anything stamped "Made in China," even as that reputation became less accurate with each passing year. But MG wasn't unknown. MG had history. MG had heritage. British consumers in particular had grown up around that octagon badge, either owning one themselves or knowing someone who did. SAIC realized they were sitting on something incredibly valuable: instant brand trust, wrapped in a name people already loved, that they now fully controlled. It was, in a strange way, one of the smartest pieces of soft power engineering in the modern auto industry, and almost nobody talked about it in those terms at the time. So SAIC did something clever. They kept building cars in China, using Chinese engineering, Chinese battery technology, Chinese manufacturing efficiency, but they sold them under the MG name in international markets. The cars looked modern, drove well, and were priced dramatically lower than European or Japanese competitors. And because the badge said MG instead of some unfamiliar Chinese company name, buyers who would have hesitated at a fully Chinese brand walked into MG dealerships without a second thought. Many of them probably never even considered where the car was actually built. The badge did exactly what it was designed to do. It worked. It worked spectacularly well. MG became one of the fastest-growing car brands in the UK. In some months, MG was outselling brands like Mazda and even challenging Toyota in certain segments. The MG ZS, a compact electric SUV, became a common sight on British roads, offering EV technology at a price that undercut virtually everyone else in the segment. Parents who wanted an electric car for the school run but couldn't afford a Tesla found themselves in an MG dealership, and they left happy. Reviewers noted the interior quality wasn't quite at German standards, but for the price, nobody could really complain. This was the quiet phase of the strategy. Build trust, build volume, build a reputation for value. And it worked so well that by the early 2020s, SAIC had something most Chinese automakers didn't have: an internationally trusted, historically rich brand that Western consumers were already comfortable buying from. Other Chinese manufacturers, without that decades of accumulated goodwill, were still fighting uphill battles to get taken seriously in the same markets where MG was quietly becoming a household name again. But volume and value alone don't change how people perceive a brand's technical capability. To do that, SAIC needed something flashier, something that would grab headlines, get car journalists talking, and prove that MG, and by extension Chinese manufacturing, could compete at the highest levels of performance engineering, not just budget commuting. That's when the Cyberster entered the picture, building a sports car to prove a point. The Cyberster wasn't designed to be a mass-market volume seller the way the MG ZS was. It was designed to be a statement. A two-seat electric roadster styled with dramatic scissor doors that lift up and outward instead of swinging open like a normal car, immediately signaling that this wasn't just another economy hatchback wearing a sports car costume. When it debuted at auto shows, crowds gathered around it the way they used to gather around Lamborghini reveals, snapping photos and asking whether it was actually a production car or just a design exercise. SAIC gave the Cyberster serious performance numbers to back up the dramatic looks. Depending on the configuration, the car produces well over 500 horsepower in its dual-motor variant, with all-wheel drive sending power to all four corners simultaneously. The 0 to 60 time lands in the mid-3-second range, numbers that used to be reserved exclusively for six-figure supercars from Italy and Germany. A decade ago, that kind of acceleration would have required a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, or a heavily modified Porsche, not a two-door roadster wearing a badge people associated with their grandfather's old commuter car. And here's where the comparison to the Porsche 911 starts to make sense instead of sounding like clickbait. The current base Porsche 911 Carrera, powered by a twin-turbo flat-six engine that Porsche has spent decades refining, does 0 to 60 in around 4 seconds. The Cyberster, in its top trim, beats that number, not by a small margin either. We're talking about a car built by a formerly bankrupt British brand, now Chinese-owned, out-accelerating the benchmark sports car that every other manufacturer on Earth measures themselves against. Let that land for a second, because it's genuinely remarkable. The Porsche 911 isn't just any sports car, it's the sports car. It's the reference point. When automotive journalists want to describe how good a new performance car is, they compare it to the 911. Ferrari compares itself to the 911. Chevrolet compares the Corvette to the 911. It is the universal yardstick. And now there's a car with an MG badge on it that beats the base model in a straight-line sprint. Of course, straight-line acceleration isn't the whole story of what makes the 911 special, and we'll get into that nuance. But the fact that this comparison is even happening, that automotive journalists are willingly putting these two cars side by side in videos and articles, tells you everything about how far MG has come in less than 2 decades. Inside the Cyberster, SAIC leaned into a futuristic cockpit design. Multiple screens wrap around the driver, including a curved digital display that replaces traditional gauges entirely. The interior looks like something out of a concept car reveal, rather than a production vehicle you can walk into a dealership and buy. That's intentional. SAIC wanted journalists and buyers alike to walk away from their first look at the Cyberster thinking, "This doesn't feel like MG anymore. This feels like the future." Even the door handles and the ambient lighting were designed to feel like a leap forward rather than an evolution. The battery technology inside the Cyberster reflects just how far Chinese battery manufacturing has advanced. China produces the overwhelming majority of the world's EV batteries at this point. Companies like CATL and BYD's battery division supplying not just Chinese brands but Tesla, Ford, and plenty of European manufacturers as well. The Cyberster benefits directly from this domestic battery supply chain, getting access to competitively priced, high-density battery packs that Western manufacturers often have to import or license at higher cost. This is actually one of the most underappreciated parts of the entire story. China didn't just get good at building electric motors and battery packs by accident. It was a deliberate, decade-long industrial policy. The Chinese government identified electric vehicles early as a sector where they could leapfrog Western manufacturers who had a century's head start on internal combustion engines. You can't easily out-engineer Toyota or Porsche on a gasoline engine they've been refining since before your grandparents were born. But an electric motor is a much newer technology. Everyone was starting closer to the same line. China poured enormous resources into battery research, motor manufacturing, and charging infrastructure, and now cars like the Cyberster are the visible result of that strategy playing out on public roads. So when people see the Cyberster and say, "How did MG build a car that beats a Porsche off the line?" the honest answer isn't really about MG at all. It's about what happens when a country spends 15 years systematically building an entire electric vehicle supply chain, from raw materials to finished product, and then applies that infrastructure to a brand with enough legacy trust to get taken seriously in Western markets. The nuance nobody wants to talk about. Now, It would be dishonest to present this story as simply Chinese car beats German legend, case closed. There's real nuance here, because the Porsche 911 isn't just fast in a straight line. It's a car built around a specific driving philosophy that's taken Porsche engineers decades to refine. The 911's rear engine layout, something most manufacturers considered a design mistake for most of automotive history, gives the car a unique weight distribution and driving character that enthusiasts describe as almost impossible to replicate. The steering feel, the way the chassis communicates road surface information back to the driver's hands, the balance through corners, these are things that come from generations of iterative refinement, not something you can engineer from scratch in a few years. No matter how much money you throw at it. Porsche engineers have spent entire careers obsessing over tiny details, the exact resistance in the steering rack, the precise tuning of the suspension bushings, details that don't show up on a spec sheet but define how a car actually feels on a winding mountain road. The Cyberster, for all its impressive acceleration numbers, is still a first-generation product from a brand that hasn't spent 70 years obsessing over steering, feel, and chassis dynamics the way Porsche has. Early reviews have praised the Cyberster's straight-line performance and its dramatic styling, but some have noted that the driving dynamics, the feel through corners, the steering precision, still has room to improve compared to a car with Porsche's pedigree. A few reviewers have even said the Cyberster feels more like a fast, well-built appliance than a true driver's car. A comment that would have stung a lot less if the acceleration numbers weren't so genuinely impressive. But here's the thing that should genuinely worry Porsche and every other legacy performance car manufacturer. The Cyberster is a first attempt. This is SAIC's opening move in the electric sports car category, and it's already beating the benchmark 911 inches a straight line and doing it at a fraction of the price. The Cyberster starts at a price point that's roughly a third of what a base Porsche 911 costs. A third. For a car that's faster off the line, with a dramatic design, futuristic interior, and the practical benefits of electric power like instant torque and lower running costs. If this is what a first-generation product looks like, what happens with the second generation? What happens when SAIC applies another 5 years of refinement to chassis tuning, to steering feel, to all the software calibration that makes a car feel alive instead of just fast? Porsche has had 70 years to refine the 911. SAIC has had roughly 5 years working seriously on performance EVs. The gap in straight-line speed has already closed. The gap in driving feel might not stay open for long either. This is the pattern we've seen play out across other industries China has targeted: solar panels, smartphones, high-speed rail. In each case, the early Chinese products were criticized as inferior copies chasing Western innovation. And in each case, within a decade or less, Chinese manufacturers weren't just catching up, they were setting the pace globally. Solar panel manufacturers in Germany and the United States that once dominated the industry found themselves undercut so badly on price that many simply shut down. High-speed rail systems that Japan and France pioneered are now being outpaced in scale and cost efficiency by networks China built in a fraction of the time. The Cyberster might be remembered as the moment the same pattern started playing out in the performance car segment specifically. What this means for the global auto industry. Legacy automakers built their entire competitive advantage around decades of engineering knowledge that took generations to accumulate. That advantage mattered enormously in a world of internal combustion engines, where the complexity of an engine, transmission, and drivetrain created a genuinely difficult technical barrier to entry. You couldn't just decide to build a great engine. It took decades of trial, error, and refinement, along with the kind of institutional knowledge that gets passed down between generations of engineers who spent their whole careers at the same company. Electric vehicles remove a huge chunk of that barrier. An electric motor is mechanically simpler than a combustion engine. Battery packs, while difficult to manufacture at scale, are more of a chemistry and manufacturing challenge than a decades of tribal knowledge challenge. This means a company like SAIC, without a century of engine-building heritage, can enter the performance car conversation in a way that would have been unthinkable in the gasoline era. This is genuinely terrifying for legacy manufacturers, if you think about it from their perspective. Porsche's moat, the thing that made it nearly impossible for a random new competitor to challenge the 911, was built on decades of internal combustion expertise. Electrification drains that moat. Suddenly, the barrier to entry for building a genuinely fast, genuinely competitive sports car has dropped dramatically, and China, with its enormous battery manufacturing base and government-backed industrial strategy, is perfectly positioned to walk right through that opening. Porsche knows this. That's part of why they've been pushing so hard into their own electric lineup with the Taycan and the upcoming electric Macan. They're trying to build electric expertise before companies like SAIC and BYD completely dominate the conversation. But building brand trust in the performance space takes time, the same way MG had to spend years quietly rebuilding trust through affordable EVs before launching something as ambitious as the Cyberster. Porsche can't simply announce it's pivoting to electric performance and expect the same devotion overnight. Trust like that gets built car by car, generation by generation, and China is now competing on that exact same timeline, just from the opposite direction. There's also a pricing dimension to this that can't be ignored. Western manufacturers, including Porsche, are locked into higher cost structures. Labor costs in Germany are significantly higher than in China. Battery costs, even when purchased from the same suppliers, often come with different margins and logistics costs, depending on how integrated a manufacturer's supply chain is. SAIC, building the Cyberster in China with domestic batteries, domestic labor, and a state-backed industrial ecosystem behind it, can offer a genuinely competitive performance car at a price point that would be nearly impossible for Porsche to match, even if Porsche wanted to. This pricing advantage isn't going away. If anything, it's likely to widen as Chinese battery technology continues improving and manufacturing scale increases even further. Every year that passes, the cost advantage Chinese EV manufacturers hold becomes more entrenched, not less. And unlike a temporary currency fluctuation, this is a structural advantage built into the entire manufacturing ecosystem, from the lithium refineries to the battery cell factories to the assembly lines themselves. The global reaction and what comes next. Automotive journalists in the UK, where MG has become a genuinely significant brand again, have been some of the most vocal about the Cyberster's surprising capability. Comparison videos between the Cyberster and various performance benchmarks have racked up millions of views, driven largely by the sheer novelty of the situation. People want to see whether the brand their grandfather drove, the brand that went bankrupt and got bought by a Chinese company, can actually go toe-to-toe with a car that costs 3 times as much. There's a strange emotional pull to watching that comparison play out, a mix of nostalgia and disbelief that's hard to replicate with any other car launch in recent memory. In markets like Australia and parts of Europe, MG's broader lineup has continued gaining market share specifically because of this halo effect. Even buyers who have no interest in the Cyberster itself, who are shopping for a practical electric SUV, benefit from the perception shift the Cyberster creates. When a brand releases a genuinely impressive halo car, it changes how people perceive the entire lineup. Suddenly, the MG badge doesn't feel like a budget compromise. It feels like a company that's actually pushing boundaries. This is a classic strategy that's worked for decades in the auto industry. Build a flashy, headline-grabbing halo car that might not sell in huge volumes itself, but changes public perception of the entire brand. Toyota did it with the Supra. Honda did it with the NSX. Now, SAIC is doing it with MG and the Cyberster, except the twist is that this halo car comes from a formerly bankrupt British brand, now under full Chinese ownership, built with Chinese battery technology, and specifically engineered to challenge one of Germany's most sacred automotive institutions. The United States remains largely absent from this story, and that absence is worth mentioning. Due to tariffs and trade restrictions specifically targeting Chinese-made vehicles, MG has essentially no meaningful presence in the American market, and the Cyberster likely won't be sold there either, at least not in its current form. This means the story of MG's resurrection and the Cyberster's arrival is playing out almost entirely outside the United States, in markets like the UK, Europe, Australia, and parts of Asia, where Chinese-built and Chinese-owned vehicles face far fewer restrictions. This creates an interesting split in how this story is perceived globally. In markets where the Cyberster is actually available and being cross-shopped against cars like the Porsche 911, the conversation is genuinely about performance, value, and what this means for the future of affordable performance EVs. In the United States, where trade barriers keep these vehicles largely out of the conversation entirely, the story reads more like a distant curiosity, a car most Americans will never actually see on the road. American car enthusiasts mostly experience the Cyberster through YouTube reviews filmed in England or Australia, watching from a distance as a story unfolds that they have no direct access to. But that gap won't necessarily stay in place forever. Trade policy shifts, political administrations change, and even if Chinese-built vehicles remain restricted in the US for years to come, the broader trend, cheaper batteries, faster development cycles, and legacy brands revitalized under Chinese ownership, challenging Western performance benchmarks, isn't something that's going to stay contained to markets outside America. Eventually, American consumers will feel this pressure too, whether through direct competition or through the way it forces Western manufacturers to respond with more competitively priced offerings of their own. The bigger picture. Step back from the Cyberster itself for a moment and look at what this story actually represents. A British brand died in 2005. Actually died, bankrupt, factory closed, thousands of jobs lost. A Chinese state-owned company bought the wreckage almost as an afterthought, picking through the remains of a failed British auto industry. For over a decade, that Chinese company quietly used the acquired brand to build trust in markets that would have been suspicious of anything more explicitly Chinese. And then, once that trust was firmly established, they used the exact same brand to launch a genuinely ambitious performance vehicle that beats one of the most respected sports cars in automotive history, in a straight-line sprint at a third of the price. This isn't really a story about MG. MG is almost incidental to what's actually happening here. This is a story about how quickly the global balance of automotive engineering power can shift once the underlying technology changes. Combustion engines protected legacy manufacturers for a century because the expertise required was genuinely difficult to replicate quickly. Electric powertrains removed a huge portion of that protection, and China, having spent over a decade deliberately building the world's most comprehensive electric vehicle supply chain, was perfectly positioned to take advantage of that shift the moment it happened. Porsche will be fine in the short term. The 911 still has decades of chassis refinement and driving feel that a first-generation Cyberster simply hasn't caught up to yet, and there's a huge segment of buyers who will pay the premium for that experience, regardless of what any Chinese competitor can accelerate to 60 in. But the direction of travel here is impossible to ignore. Legacy manufacturers are watching their traditional advantages erode in real time, and brands that most people had written off as historical footnotes are suddenly relevant again, backed by industrial capacity and battery technology that Western companies simply don't have equivalent access to at the same cost. The MG badge that used to represent a struggling, nearly bankrupt British sports car company now sits on a vehicle that automotive journalists genuinely compare to a Porsche 911. That sentence would have sounded absurd in 2010. It sounds absurd even now, honestly, if you say it out loud without context, but it's true. And it's a preview of a broader shift happening across the entire auto industry, where the century-old advantages of legacy engineering knowledge are getting rapidly compressed by a completely different kind of competitive advantage: state-backed industrial scale, deliberate battery technology investment, and a willingness to use acquired Western brands as a trust-building bridge into markets that would otherwise have been resistant to the products themselves. The Cyberster is fast, it's dramatic-looking, it's a genuine engineering achievement for a brand that shouldn't even exist anymore by most historical logic. But the real story isn't the car itself, it's what the car represents about how quickly the rules of an entire industry can get rewritten once the underlying technology shifts beneath everyone's feet, and how a country that plays the long game industrially can turn a bankrupt British brand into a genuine threat to Porsche's crown jewel in less time than it takes most manufacturers to develop a single new engine platform from scratch. Whether or not the Cyberster ever truly matches the 911's driving feel through a mountain pass, the acceleration numbers alone have already done their job. They've made people stop and ask the question that matters most for Porsche's future. If a resurrected British brand under Chinese ownership can already beat you in a straight line on their first serious attempt, what happens when they get their second attempt right too?